They called it madness. Others called it devotion. But the truth was far darker. In the year 1349, when plague swept across Europe, a noble family in the region of Auvergne did something unthinkable. They barred the gates of their castle, sealed the doors with iron, and ordered every servant inside to choose, stay forever or leave and never return. None who stayed were ever seen again. Records speak of food hoarded, windows bricked, and messages refused. Days turned to weeks, then years. Peasants whispered of ghostly music drifting from the battlements, of screams echoing through stone walls long after the household should have starved. Priests who demanded entry were turned away at sword point. The family's crest faded from the rolls of nobility, but their fortress still stood, silent, impenetrable, and cursed. And the single question that has haunted generations remains: what secret was so terrible that an entire bloodline chose to vanish alive inside their own tomb? The House of Veyrac, that was their name. Once spoken with reverence, later in whispers. They had ruled their lands for 3 centuries, their banners flying high above the forests of Auvergne. But by the mid-14th century, their story turned into something closer to legend. When the Black Death tore through the countryside, it did more than kill. It unmasked the fragile threads holding society together. Lords fled their holdings, priests abandoned their flock, families betrayed one another in desperation. Yet the Veyracs did not flee. They withdrew. Chronicles from nearby abbeys record strange movements in the months before their disappearance. Carts loaded with barrels of grain, salted meat, and wine passed through the gates. Wagons filled with lime and stone went in, never to come out. The castle blacksmith worked day and night, reforging locks and bolts. One monk wrote that he saw masons bricking up windows, sealing sunlight out of entire wings. "It is not fortification," he warned in his journal. "It is entombment." When the pestilence reached the village below, peasants rushed toward the castle seeking refuge. The drawbridge lowered for a moment, but only to cast out those already inside who had hesitated to swear an oath. Servants who refused the vow of eternal confinement were thrust into the mud, some beaten, some mutilated so they could never speak again. Behind them, the gates rose with a finality that silenced even the wailing. No plea, no prayer, no knocking hand was ever answered again. At first, smoke rose from the chimneys, proof of life within. But as seasons turned, that too ceased. What unnerved the villagers most was not the silence, but the sounds that did slip through. Once a shepherd swore he heard an organ playing in the dead of night, a hymn twisted into dissonance. A year later, a traveling merchant claimed to hear screaming, long, unbroken cries that rose and fell with the wind, but no fire nor famine ever forced those gates open. It was as though the Veyracs had chosen not only death, but something deeper: erasure. Rumors swelled into darker explanations. Some said the family had uncovered relics during the plague, objects of such power and corruption that they dared not let them see daylight. Others believed they carried an illness, not of the body, but of the soul, and their confinement was penance. Children dared one another to approach the moat at night, swearing they saw candles moving in the high windows, though the glass had been sealed with mortar years before. Every sighting deepened the terror. The castle was no longer a fortress, but a tomb that refused to rot. And then came the manuscript. 2 decades later, when plague swept again, a wandering friar arrived with a book bound in cracked leather. He claimed he had received it from a dying noble who confessed he was the last of the Veyrac blood. Within its pages, written in a trembling hand, was a single declaration: we were never hiding from death. We were hiding from what we brought into the world. That one line changed everything. For if the Veyracs sealed themselves not against the plague, then against what? And why would a family erase themselves so completely that even their name was struck from noble rolls? Whatever truth remained behind those walls had been chosen as a fate worse than extinction, and it is here that their legend turns from history into horror. The manuscript gave a fragment of an answer, but it raised more questions than it resolved. Scholars who examined its Latin script noted strange marginalia, symbols that were neither Christian nor pagan, drawn in the edges of the parchment as though meant to conceal rather than illuminate. Beside them, one phrase repeated like an obsession: tacere aut mori, to be silent or to die, the oath of silence. Whispers spread that before sealing their gates, the Vayraks had forced every remaining soul in the castle, knights, servants, even children, to swear this vow. To speak of what they had seen or done would mean death, carried out not by enemy hands but by their own. Suicide, murder, or some ritual, the details of which never survived, no one could say. All that mattered was that silence was demanded, and silence was kept. The friar's testimony hinted at what lay beneath this oath. He spoke of chambers built beneath the castle, carved hastily yet deliberately, their walls lined with lime to mask decay. He spoke of relics carried in wrapped cloth, never revealed to the eyes of those who transported them. And he spoke of one child, the youngest daughter of the house, who was said to have been touched by something during the height of the plague. Her birth, the friar hinted, was no ordinary birth. She cried not in screams, but in low tones that resembled words, words no one could understand, yet none could forget. The villagers outside spun their own explanations. Some believed the family had summoned something in desperation to protect themselves from the pestilence. A spirit, a demon, or worse, something for which no name survived. Others thought the youngest child was not afflicted but chosen, and the family's confinement was not punishment, but devotion, a cult growing around their own bloodline. Some even said she bore a mark, a sigil that changed shape when watched, carved not in flesh but beneath it, shifting like something alive. Documents recovered centuries later show a series of transactions before the castle's ceiling. Large sums of coin vanished from the family's coffers into obscure monastic orders known for heretical practices. One particular order, the Custodes Umbri, the Keepers of the Shadow, were whispered to have trafficked in forbidden texts smuggled from the East, books that spoke of beings older than Eden. And when the last records of the house vanish, so too do the accounts of these monks, as though the two threads of history were bound together and then cut all at once. Some claim the oath of silence was more than a command, it was a contagion of its own. Breaking it did not simply risk punishment, but madness. A knight who deserted before the gates closed was found months later wandering barefoot in the woods, muttering the same word over and over, tacit, 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 until his tongue swelled and blackened as if by poison. Chroniclers dismissed it as superstition, but the villagers remembered, and they warned their children, never speak the name of the Vayraks after nightfall. Generations later, when treasure seekers crept near the ruins, they claimed the land itself still carried the weight of the vow. One party in the 16th century recorded finding a sealed stairway in the outer wall, and though they broke the stones open, they heard a groaning echo beneath and fled without entering. Another account describes a soldier in Napoleon's army camping by the ruins. He awoke to find his companion dead, his lips sewn shut with black thread, though no needle was ever found. Local lore insists these were not coincidences, but the oath itself punishing intruders, carrying its silence forward into new centuries. The oath of silence becomes clearer in this light. It was not a vow taken lightly, nor one born of ordinary secrecy. It was the final seal on whatever pact or terror the Vayraks had unleashed within their own walls. To reveal it would not merely damn the family, but perhaps the land itself. Silence was survival, and death for those who disobeyed was mercy. But one question refuses to die, no matter how tightly the past tries to bury it. If the Vayraks truly locked themselves away to contain what they had brought forth, did they succeed? Or did they only ensure that whatever lived inside those walls would remain undisturbed, waiting for centuries, patient as stone? If the oath of silence was the lock, the castle itself was the coffin. No one who lived beyond those walls ever emerged, and no witness could say what passed within. Yet fragments of testimony scattered across Europe suggest that the House of Vayrak did not merely withdraw. They prepared for a transformation. What could life have been like in those first weeks after the gates closed? Chroniclers tell us the family sealed entire wings, bricking up windows to keep out both light and God's eye. Kitchens overflowed with barrels of salted meat, and the cellars groaned under the weight of grain and wine. But what food could last years? Some argue that they never intended to live as they once had, that the stores were not for sustenance, but for sacrifice. An abbey scribe in Limoges wrote that the Veyroks did not entomb themselves to preserve life, but to preserve silence. In one preserved parchment, a visiting stonemason described a chamber built beneath the foundations, its walls coated with lime to mask decay. He claimed the room had no door, only a stone trap set from above, as if meant to lower something in, but never let it out. And in his testimony, he drew a symbol, a circle broken by 3 lines. The same mark appears in the margins of the Veyrok manuscript, beside the repeated vow of silence. Was this the emblem of their secret, or the seal that bound it? Rumors grew darker as generations passed. Some believed the youngest daughter, the child who bore the shifting sigil, was entombed below in that lime-lined chamber. A vessel, not for life, but for something else entirely. Villagers whispered that she was the heart that beats without end, and that her cries could be heard on certain nights when the wind cut across the stone. Others believed she had grown, lived, and ruled within those walls, her presence both curse and queen to her imprisoned family. Yet not one soul ever emerged to confirm or deny it. By the 16th century, when ruins still jutted black against the hills, treasure hunters and pilgrims alike sought the truth. One account tells of 3 men who broke through a wall and descended into the lower halls. They never returned. Their companions swore they heard voices echoing from below, chanting in a language no one knew. When they finally dragged the men's bodies from the stair, their eyes had been gouged out, yet their mouths were sewn closed. Black thread knotted into their flesh. No treasure was found, only fear. Historians have long debated whether these stories were folklore or fact, but scattered across Europe appear references to the custodes umbrae, the keepers of the shadow, and their dealings with the Veyroks. Surviving fragments of their texts speak of the binding of flesh to silence and the vessel of the inverted word. Scholars of the occult have speculated that the youngest daughter may have been used as such a vessel, her body carrying what they called the other voice. If this is true, then the oath was not merely a vow of secrecy, it was containment. And yet the silence was never complete. Travelers swore they heard hymns twisted into discord, organs groaning in empty chapels, screams too long and too steady to be human. One 18th century antiquarian described climbing near the ruins and hearing a child's laughter echo beneath the stone, though the castle had been abandoned for centuries. He fled, and in his journal he wrote, "It is not an echo of the past. It is a voice that waits." By Napoleon's time, the castle was seen less as ruin and more as infection. Local soldiers refused to bivouac near it, insisting their comrades fell sick if they lingered. Priests declared the ground unholy, though no exorcism was ever attempted. Too many who approached returned altered. A French officer described a private who walked the perimeter and afterward refused to speak, even under lashes, until he bit through his own tongue. When the army left, they did not demolish the ruins. They left them standing, untouched, as though fearful of what might be released if stone were broken. Daily existence inside those walls has been imagined by later historians with a blend of fascination and horror. They speak of candlelit halls where shadows grew long and permanent, of rituals whispered instead of spoken. For even words themselves were forbidden. Perhaps the family gathered in the chapel not to pray, but to chant in languages unknown, binding themselves further to their oath. Servants, if they remained, became less attendants than disciples, their loyalty enforced by fear and necessity. Every act, from eating to sleeping, may have been bound by ritual, each day a rehearsal for eternity. Punishments for disobedience, some believe, were carried out not with the sword, but through the oath itself. One legend speaks of a boy who tried to flee through the postern gate, only to be found the next morning hanging from the battlements with his lips sewn shut in the same black thread that centuries later. Whether man or oath performed the deed, no one dared question it again. For centuries, peasants warned their children never to linger near the ruins, lest they hear their own name whispered from the stones. Travelers who mocked the legend often returned pale and silent, some abandoning speech entirely for the rest of their lives. Was it superstition, or was the oath itself alive, seeping through walls, feeding on those who listened too closely? What remains undeniable is that the House of Veyrok succeeded in one thing. They erased themselves. No heirs emerged. No artifacts survived beyond the manuscript and scattered accounts. Their lands passed to the crown, their names struck from noble rolls, their fortress left to rot. And yet even in ruin, the castle was never lifeless. The stones themselves seemed to hum with the weight of the oath, as if the vow outlived the bloodline that swore it. And so the question gnaws still. Was the oath of silence a shield or a prison? Did it protect the world from what lay within, or protect what lay within from the world? And if the latter is true, then who, after all these centuries, has been the prisoner, and who has been the jailer? The silence of the Vayraks might have ended with their extinction, but history has a way of leaving scars. What they locked away behind stone did not remain contained to their castle alone. Traces of their legacy appeared in the margins of chronicles, in strange symbols carved into roadside shrines, in whispered prayers that bore no resemblance to Christian liturgy. It was as if the oath, once sworn, spread outward like a shadow, infecting those who came near it. In the 15th century, shepherds in the Auvergne reported finding livestock dead, with mouths crudely stitched shut. No wolves had touched the flesh, no blood spilled, only silence, forced and grotesque, as though the curse of the Vayraks had seeped into the land itself. Priests performed blessings, but the killings continued for years until whole flocks vanished. The peasants came to believe the soil itself had been consecrated not to God, but to the oath. By the 17th century, the legend of the house had traveled farther than the ruins. Scholars in Paris wrote of a heretical sect in the countryside who wore black cords around their lips during secret gatherings, claiming descent from the last servants of the Vayraks. They did not speak prayers, only hummed tones in low resonance, which they said was the language before words. Authorities dismissed them as charlatans, but when their meeting house was raided, every member was found with tongues removed, sliced clean, not by blades, but by something sharper. One French chronicler, Jacques Lemaire, documented his visit to the ruins in 1684. He described finding crude carvings of the circle and three-line symbol etched into the stones near the moat, fresher than the medieval mortar around them. Lemaire recorded a chilling encounter. A boy no older than 12 who claimed his mother heard voices from the castle at night, promising knowledge beyond death. When asked what knowledge, the child replied only, "The words that do not end." Lemaire fled the region and never returned. The forbidden legacy spread into darker territories with time. In the 18th century, occultists across Europe cited the Vayraks in grimoires, naming them the Silent Lords. Some believed their bloodline had survived in secret, carrying the oath across generations. Others claimed the oath itself had become detached from its origin, a living covenant searching for hosts. Cases of sudden muteness, suicides after cryptic confessions, and entire villages struck by collective silence were attributed to its lingering power. Skeptics argue these accounts are embellishments, legends exaggerated to thrill or terrify. Yet the consistency of the details, the stitched mouths, the black thread, the shifting sigil, suggests something more than myth. When patterns persist for centuries across borders and tongues, they are rarely coincidence. They are echoes. And perhaps that was the true horror of the House of Vayrak. Not merely that they sealed themselves within their own fortress, but that their silence was never confined. It seeped outward, invisible yet potent, weaving itself into history like a stain that cannot be scrubbed. To this day, the ruins remain forbidden ground. Local maps mark them, but villagers refuse to guide strangers there. They say the oath waits still, humming beneath the soil, ready to claim the voice of anyone who dares disturb it. The family may have vanished, but their silence did not die with them. It became inheritance, curse, and contagion all at once. And as long as the ruins endure, so too does the question. Was it the Vayraks who imprisoned the terror, or are we the ones still living inside its walls without knowing? Centuries passed, yet the story of the House of Vayrak did not fade. Instead, it mutated, carrying itself into the modern age in ways more insidious than ever. By the 19th century, when archaeology became fashion, the ruins drew curious minds. But curiosity proved a dangerous hunger. In 1821, a team of antiquarians from Lyon attempted to excavate the castle cellars. Their journals tell of walls unusually thick, with cavities hidden between layers of stone. When they broke into one chamber, they found only dust and fragments of bone too small to be human. Still, the men reported hearing faint sounds, like murmured conversation, though no mouth spoke. Within weeks, two of them took their own lives, leaving behind notes filled with lines of ink black circles crossed by three strokes. The same sigil again. Later, in 1896, a folklorist named Emile Charvet camped at the site for 3 nights. He hoped to separate truth from legend. On the second night, his diary records that he woke to the sound of a girl singing in a language he did not recognize. When he followed the voice, he found the ruins utterly silent, yet his ears bled when he tried to deny what he'd heard. Charvet abandoned his study, but his last entry is the most disturbing. The oath is not memory, it is mouth. It seeks to speak through us. By the early 20th century, stories of the ruins took on a new form. Locals spoke of travelers who vanished without trace. Others were found wandering the fields, lips raw as if sewn, though no stitches remain. Doctors dismissed these cases as hysteria. Yet one physician in 1927 wrote privately of a patient who whispered of dreams, where the youngest daughter of the Veyrac pressed her face to his, lips unmoving, yet her voice pouring directly into his skull. He burned his clinic a month later and hung himself among the ashes. World wars came and went, but the ruins remained untouched. Soldiers bivouacked nearby reported hearing chants at night, and some swore they saw lights moving inside the collapsed halls. Commanders ordered the area avoided, not out of superstition, but because too many soldiers deserted after being stationed there. Fear had outlasted faith. Today the castle is little more than jagged walls and shadowed vaults, overgrown with ivy. Yet the oath lingers. Paranormal investigators who entered with cameras reported their equipment failing, batteries drained to nothing, their recordings corrupted with whispers. One tape recovered in 1973 plays only a single phrase on repeat, spoken in a dozen overlapping voices. "We are not gone, we are within." Even now, villagers refuse to approach after dark. They speak of animals circling the ruins and falling dead in silence, of travelers returning voiceless, and of the sound that should not exist, the echo of a heartbeat under the earth when no one is near, a pulse without a body, a voice without breath. If the oath was meant to contain, then its prison walls are crumbling, and if it was meant to protect, then its silence may soon be broken. The question we must ask is no longer what the Veyracs feared, but whether we have inherited that same fear without even knowing it. And so the story comes full circle. The house of Veyrac vanished, not through sword, not through fire, but through silence. They did not flee death, they embraced it, sealed within their own fortress, swallowed by the very oath they swore. Yet their silence was never still. It bled into the land, into the centuries, into the ears of anyone who dared to listen. What makes their story so disturbing is not the idea that they hid a monster, but that they may have become it. A family that erased itself so completely that their name was struck from history, yet their presence still lingers in echoes, in stitched mouths, in whispers that circle the ruins like smoke. They are gone, and yet they are not. The oath ensured that. Think of what it means. An entire lineage choosing extinction, not in despair, but in purpose. What could demand such a sacrifice? What knowledge or horror is so great that it must be buried alive, carried not in books or relics, but in flesh, in blood, in silence itself? The more we peer into their story, the less certain we become of what is legend and what is memory. But perhaps that is the nature of the oath. It blurs the line between the two until we can no longer tell where history ends and the echo begins. Even today, the ruins breathe. Locals still whisper of a pulse beneath the earth, of voices that weave through the night air. Technology cannot capture it, faith cannot banish it, and reason cannot explain it. It endures, patient, waiting. Perhaps it waits for a voice strong enough, foolish enough to answer it. So we return to the question left in that single line of the manuscript. We were never hiding from death. We were hiding from what we brought into the world. If that is true, then the Veyracs may have succeeded only in postponing the inevitable. For what they contained was never destroyed, only bound. And bindings do not last forever. There are scholars who argue the oath was never about secrecy or protection at all, but about infection. that the silence itself was the disease, passed from mouth to mouth, century to century, until it no longer needed the family who first swore it. If that is true, then we are not observers of the Veyrock tragedy. We are its continuation. Each retelling, each whisper, each mention of their name gives the oath new breath, new ears, new mouths. Perhaps that is why villagers still refuse to guide travelers to the ruins. Not because they fear what lies inside, but because they fear what may follow those who return. Silence is not emptiness. It is a presence. It waits to be filled. And once it is filled, it spreads. Think of the stitched mouths that appear across centuries. Think of the black thread. Think of the children who claim to hear words that do not end. The heartbeat that should not exist beneath ruined stone. All these fragments are not memories of the past. They are symptoms of something still alive, something waiting to be spoken. So ask yourself this. If a family once chose to lock themselves inside their own tomb to keep the world safe, what happens when the stone finally crumbles? When silence breaks? When the oath seeks a new mouth to speak through? Perhaps the Vayraks were not the last. Perhaps the oath did not end with them at all. And perhaps even now it is listening. For you. Silence is never empty. Silence is never safe. Silence is never finished.